CALED's podcast series shares information to help economic development professionals and communities of all sizes build resilient, sustainable economies through effective economic development policies and initiatives.
Welcome to today's CALED podcast. My name is Michelle Stevens, and I am the Program Director for CALED. Today, we are discussing rural economic recovery and resiliency, and we are joined by Tara Schiff with Mariposa County and Brittany Miller with the City of Santa Rosa.
Hi.
Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you too. We wanted to start off with an opening question as to why is rural recovery and resiliency unique?
So can I go first? Is that okay, Brittany?
Absolutely.
I'll go ahead and then you can chime in with an OES follow-up on this. But from an economic standpoint, there's a lot of reasons why it's different. First and foremost, let me just talk about some of the challenges. Some of the challenges is a lot of the rural communities are more remote and isolated. So when we have these emergencies, it's very difficult to get to our areas, and then also very difficult for recovery to reignite that revenue loss. So we're not real populated as well, and that also has a challenge. Some of the things that are positive and some of the successes we've seen just being in a rural community is our communities are so tight. We're very close knit. So when we have these emergencies, we come together. We come together as a community and really work hard to get our county back on its feet again. So those are some of the good things that I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's a common phrase that folks will bring up about rural recovery is that the community really knows each other well. So it's not like you're just trying to help a stranger, you're really helping your neighbor. Brittany, when you're thinking about rural landscapes, what geographic elements shape your response?
Well, as an emergency manager, which is the perspective I bring, it's so important to understand the community you're serving, whether rural or urban, because it's going to shape how you respond to an emergency, right? And there's lots of factors that go into that, such as, you have to think about the unique qualities that make up your community, especially if you're rural. So, for instance, do you have maybe only one way in and one way out of your community? So if that ends up being impacted, that could severely change the landscape of what the response would look like. Similarly, if you have a large tourist attraction in your area, in the rural components, like I think of Sonoma County, what draws visitors here is the wine industry, and to some degree the beer industry. So if we have a disaster that impacts that and keeps tourists away for a period of time, that could have severe economic impacts. So we have to factor that into our response as well. And then, kind of another thing to consider too is kind of how the rural community is organized. So I think of Sonoma County and Santa Rosa in particular. We happen to have our 55 and up community in the complete east side of our city with one 2-lane road in and out. So, and they've been severely impacted by fire. So as you can imagine, when we're planning for a response, we have to think about the timing to get these individuals out of Dodge, right? And what happens if that one way in and one way out are impacted? What do we do? So it definitely, all of those components factor into our response and our planning for response.
Now, would you say, Tara already touched on one of the positives of being in a rural community. Do you have anything to add on that? Like, do you feel there's a positive to working on recovery and resiliency in a rural community?
Yeah, I agree with what Tara said. You know the community, they often know you as government. There's a lot more of a partnership there. We're not strangers. where when you have a very large urban population or a transient population, because maybe they live in the city but work elsewhere or vice versa, it's harder to know your population and to outreach with them. Because a big part of what I do as an emergency manager is share information not only about what we're doing to aid in the response in the middle of a response or recovery, but we need to get them the information and they need to know what they need to do to get their process started. And it's so much easier to do when you're dealing with a smaller, tight knit community than something more urban and dense.
Well, and
Yeah.
I can elaborate on that too. Just being a small community and being a small county government, we don't have all of those hoops and challenges to go through. We know each other, and the county government works very closely together. So when we have an emergency and we have to pass emergency ordinances, it tends to go very quickly here because we're all very used to working together. I'm right up the stairs from planning, right down the street from public works, whereas in bigger urban areas, they're all spread out and they're much larger. We all know each other, so things tend to go very quickly. The other sad thing is in rural communities such as Mariposa County, we've had so many emergencies that we've started to become a very well-oiled machine because of the experience. So we're to the point where everyone on the EOC knows each other and we get into motion really quickly. So
Yeah,
I don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage. It's
we're
definitely not
very
positive.
we're very similar here in Sonoma County and really related to that. And you mentioned the Emergency Operations Center. We have to know what's happening in the community and who's impacted so that we can serve them. A lot of times in a more rural community, it's easier to identify those things that are impacting the community. Because again, if you're dealing with a real urban dense population, the word may not get to government folks like me who have to respond as quickly. Where if it's a smaller, tight knit community, they know how to reach us, how to share what's going on, and then we can respond much quicker and more efficiently as well. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think, unfortunately, both Mariposa and Sonoma County, where Santa Rosa is located, have had a lot of practice in the last
Yes.
few years. So
Unfortunately.
you guys are going to be pros whether you want it or not.
I-
Tara, I have a question for you. So, from the economic developer point of view, and since you are an economic developer in a rural community, what is your role prior to a disaster, during, and after an economic disruption? Whether, and I said this disaster, but it could be a disaster, it could be an economic disruption in the way of a company closing or something like that. But what do you do as an economic developer before, during, and after?
Sure. And Mariposa has experienced economic disruption over and above natural disasters. We actually had the closure of the federal government, which affected all the gates for our national park, which is Yosemite. And Brittany had mentioned that they have the wine industry. People come, we have Yosemite National Park. So it's not just disasters that cause economic disruption in Mariposa County. And from years of experience, I have learned what my role is. And my role prior is planning. So I make sure that I have everything in order. And because I've had years of experience and several disasters that I've worked on, I know I have a list, I have a contact list of who I contact beforehand. And have that all prepared. We also prepared an economic vitality strategy and updated that in several years ago. Keep that. I do an annual update. That is something that is key. So keep things going during a disruption. So beforehand, my role is a planner to make sure that everything is organized in the event of a disaster or an economic disruption. During it, I'm on the emergency operations Center, the EOC. I'm a member. And I think we had talked previously that when I first came on board 10 years ago, I was not asked to join the EOC because I don't think that everybody saw business advocacy and business support as a necessary part of the EOC. And after the Detweiler fire that destroyed 75 homes, and about half of those were home businesses, they suddenly realized, and it impacted our downtown commercial area. They suddenly realized that I did need economic development, did need to be present. So I am part of the EOC. My role is to get information out to the businesses, make sure they're aware what's going on. If we're evacuated, and the town was evacuated once, I make sure that they're aware that they needed to be evacuated, and then know when they can come back and resume business. Afterward, it's a cheerleader and really getting everybody back on their feet again, promoting outside, working with our tourism bureau and other agencies to promote that our county is still here, that we still exist, and really get our economic center back again. And like I said, a cheerleader, working with the businesses, making sure after the recent Oak Fire last summer, I'm now working with businesses, making sure that they all got their emergency injury, economic injury disaster loans, the EIDLs, through SBA, Small Business Administration, any kind of financial or business relief resources that I have, I make sure that they get that so that we can recover as a community.
Yeah. It's wild to me to think that when you first started, they weren't including you in the EOC, because businesses are such a key part of the community. And often, most commonly, businesses are owned by the community members. So to leave that out seems like such a miss. But Brittany, you're looking at this topic from a slightly different angle with the emergency services lens. What do you think? What role does risk assessment play in your activities before a disaster?
Sure. And I did want to echo what you both said. Business development and small business focus in response is critical. So for those listening out there who have that role and maybe don't have a seat in your local emergency operations center, get in there, because response and recovery can't be effective unless we're hitting all aspects of the community, and that includes businesses and making sure that our economy keeps moving along despite the disruption. And I'll talk about that a lot more, but I just had to plug that. Like, absolutely, it's a vital role in our EOC, and I'm glad to hear that it's happening in others, and hopefully that follows suit in other jurisdictions as well. So risk assessment, that is kind of the bread and butter of what I do when I'm not actually actively responding to an emergency and running our city's emergency operations center. A big part of risk assessment is knowing what you could face, right? You have to know what could happen in your community based on the geographic landscape. What are you earthquake prone? Are you tornado prone? What flood zone do you happen to be in, or are you in a flood zone? Et cetera, et cetera. And you need to take a look at what's happened historically, and how bad it could be potentially based on the scientific data that's available. What it does for folks like me is it helps us prioritize. And what I mean by that is you identify what your risks are, and I'll talk about the process in just a second, but you identify what your risks are, then you have to identify how you're going to address them, right? And there's a prioritization process that goes into that. Because that way everything's not a priority, because then nothing's a priority. You can't get anything done that way. You have to take small pieces of the elephant, if you will, and kind of break it off into chunks. So the risk assessment process that emergency managers typically use I wrote about it in the playbook. It starts out with what's called a THIRA, or a threat and hazard identification and risk assessment plan. I know that's a mouthful. That's why we say THIRA. But basically what you do with that plan is you look at what I mentioned. You conduct a risk assessment and you look at what could impact your community. Um, and you identify it and kind of rack and stack it of like what your biggest problems are, what are things maybe you're a little less concerned about. Then you go into a process where you do kind of a self-evaluation in your jurisdiction. And that's the state preparedness report, or it could also be a local preparedness report. We do one here in the city, but it's based on what we identified in the THIRA as our risks. How prepared are we to respond to those risks? And you got to be honest, right? If you say, oh, we're great at everything, and you're not going to be able to really address maybe what the shortfalls are and work towards fixing them. So we identify kind of what our strengths and maybe areas of weakness are, so that again we can prioritize and start filling those gaps in maybe our response and our ability to serve the community. And then last but not least is mitigation planning, which is kind of how it all comes full circle. So you identify your risks in the THIRA. You say, how great are we at being able to respond to this right now? And then mitigation planning is all about finding ways to alleviate those risks, whether it be, maybe building a levee in a jurisdiction to keep the floodwaters from impacting a flood-prone area, or maybe it's doing vegetation management in your fire-prone areas to have less fuel for the fire to take off, right? So you get to identify those projects and mitigation planning, then start prioritizing what you want to work on first based on the greatest need, and then you can start applying funding towards that. You can start applying work towards that, whatever that may look like. So that's kind of the risk assessment circle, if you will, and we're continually doing it. Often these plans are cyclical, so they'll be, reevaluated every couple of years. As mitigation projects are completed, you go back to the drawing board and then identify what's next. So it's an ongoing process, and it's a huge piece of what emergency managers do pre-disaster.
Yeah, and it seems to me that that last step that you mentioned, that mitigation step, is really what helps ensure that a community is going to be resilient moving forward. It's one thing to identify a shortcoming or a risk, but it's another to then say, okay, now what do we do about it?
Absolutely. One example we actually have, we had the Tubbs fire in 2017, which was horrific, and he had a huge impact on the city of Santa Rosa. One of our shortcomings that we identified in the after action report was our alert and warning capability and having redundancy. So actually a hazard mitigation grant became available, and based on our planning that we did in the risk assessment process, we said, we need to have more redundancy in how we can alert the public that something bad is happening so they can get out of Dodge. So we actually got a hazard mitigation grant where we were able to purchase 12,000 NOAA weather radios, which are battery backup. They don't require power or cell signal. So if all else fails, you will get an alert on a NOAA weather radio. And we were able to give those out to our community 2 summers ago in drive-through events. So it's small things like that, again, in a more rural community can have a huge impact. So now we have 12,000 of those out in our community, and I could push a button and make sure that they get the alert on them during a disaster when there's life-threatening situations happening. So the sky's the limit really on what you can do. It's just, what you come up with as a community.
Yeah. And both you and Tara have brought up things that I've been remiss in not mentioning. Like, one thing I think both as economic developers and emergency outreach personnel, you guys are able to take resources and funnel those to the people most in need. So Brittany, your example just now with the NOAA radios, that's a great example of like finding out, okay, this resource is being offered by the federal government. How can we take advantage of that to make our community more safe?
Mm-hmm.
And Tara referenced the EIDL financing that was available, and making sure that her businesses knew about it, were able to apply, receive the funds. So I think that's a huge role that people sometimes forget that local government can play, just getting the resources into the hands of those who need them. And then the other thing you mentioned, Brittany, is you referenced that you wrote about this in the playbook. And I know at the end of this conversation, we're going to reference the playbook, but it bears mentioning that all of the information that we're talking about today, both you and Tara were authors of the playbook. And so the info about the thyra you can find in the playbook. Some of the work that Tara mentioned, like the Mariposa, oh gosh, I'm going to forget its name, but the planning
Economic vitality strategy, the EVS.
Tara, thank you. Yeah, the economic vitality strategy that is focused on in the playbook as a case study, as well as the work that you've done in planning and outreach. So all of these topics that we're broaching today, you can learn more about in the playbook. But those are quick asides. This question actually is for both Tara and Brittany. You guys can choose who wants to go first. But how would you say coordination and collaboration fit into your goals and actions? And can you provide a couple of examples of how to do this?
Tara, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go and then I'm sure you can wrap it up with a really nice bow. So, collaboration and coordination are absolute key to any disaster, any economic disruption, and you cannot operate in a silo during an emergency. That's one of the reasons that we formed the EOCs, the Emergency Operations Centers. We also have the LACs, the Local Assistance Centers. For those of you who don't know what those are and haven't had the opportunity, who have been very lucky and have not had an emergency that required a local assistance center, that is when very shortly after a major national disaster, we get together and we have every resource come to the county, the community, and we have pretty much kind of like a job fair, but it's every resource from CALED to Red Cross to economic development to USDA to our vital records here. We usually have about 30, 40 resources available at these LACs. We all work together as a team. Anybody who has been part of LAC knows that we do like a cheer in the morning and a cheer in the evening because we're working as a team to support our community who just endured a very traumatic event and to help the survivors of this event. So I'll give an example. We had the Oak Fire this summer, which destroyed 174 homes in Mariposa County, which is very disastrous because we're very small. We have 7,000 households. So during the Oak Fire, we had the LAC and we all got together. I actually shared a table with the Chamber of Commerce, and she and I made sure that all of the businesses where their concerns were being addressed. What we identified in the LAC and the Local Assistance Center after the Oak Fire was that over 45 of the homes destroyed were in-home businesses. So they were either vacation rentals, there were general contractors, there were just in-home businesses, there are caterers, there are house cleaners, and they lost everything. So the general contractors, the house cleaners, the in-house offices, they lost all their equipment. So you're looking at people who not only lost their home, but they lost their livelihood too. So we got together after the LAC and we coordinated a fund through, we have an alliance here, and the alliance was great. It's called the Alliance for Community Transformations, and they actually put caseworkers. They worked with the county, coordinated with the county to have caseworkers for all of the survivors. I coordinated with the alliance and with all of the caseworkers to reach out to those survivors who were businesses. I had already identified them, so I gave them my list from the plaque. And we had identified some of the needs that they needed. One of the needs was contractors' tools. Very expensive, very hard to get covered in insurance. And we raised over $50,000 and also reached out to Home Depot, some of our local hardware stores to get supplies and tools into these businesses' hands so that they could make money to get back on their feet. Because I thought about that. I thought if I was evacuated, I thought if I lost my home, I still have a job to go to. These people have no way to make money. So we worked together as a team. The Alliance worked with me, they worked with the chamber, we have a community foundation here who funneled all of the donations from the community and from outside the community and make sure that it was dispersed correctly through the Alliance. And that was our second time doing that. So we did have experience. We did that in the Detweiler fire too. But so just to put everything in a nutshell, you cannot operate in a silo during an emergency. You have got to work with your partners. You've got to put egos aside. We are in this for the community. We are here to make the community better and to get through this. And you're going to be stronger on the other side of the emergency. So, Brittany, do you have input on that?
Absolutely. You summarized it really well, and I'll just add a couple additional things from my perspective. Like risk assessment, coordination, and collaboration is pretty much what I do, both before, during, and after a disaster. So you mentioned the Emergency Operations Center. So like in a city jurisdiction like I'm in, it brings together representatives from all of our city departments. So police, fire, public works, water, code enforcement, business development, you name it. They all come into one room. And that's what I run, is making sure that they are working collaboratively on responding to the disaster to support the community. So it makes sure that we don't have blind spots. And that involves working directly with the community and getting their input as well. So that's all about coordination and collaboration. Some people even call their emergency operations centers emergency coordination centers. You'll hear that used interchangeably, because that's really what we're doing. The tactical life-saving response is happening in the field. We're supporting them, keeping that big picture perspective on what's happening, and we're ensuring that all of the resources we have available in the city are working towards solving those problems we identify. So that's huge. And I know you mentioned that, Tara. And you also mentioned the Local Assistance Center, or the LAC. That's huge. I mean, in the Tubbs fire, for example, in 2017 that we had here, thousands of people were displaced from their homes. And you imagine, in some cases, they had minutes to get in their car and flee, unfortunately, because of some of the challenges we had. They lost everything. They lost their driver's license. They lost their cell phone. They lost their medications. So what the LAC does, like Tara mentioned, is it becomes kind of a one-stop shop for people to begin to rebuild and start the recovery process. And it's all in one location. So that's all about coordination and collaboration as well. I mean, it's bringing, folks like from the DMV to get a driver's license started again, vital records, like you mentioned, to get birth certificates and things like that back. And FEMA's sitting there so they can start the recovery process, maybe looking into getting some reimbursement back. So it's huge. And it's not only the city working together. So for example, City of Santa Rosa falls within the Sonoma County, and we call it the operational area. So there's several cities, several jurisdictions, several private organizations, and we all collaboratively work together using a process we call the incident command system, which I won't bore you all with, but it's a structured way that we all come together and work together to respond and recover from disasters. And it's all about coordination and collaboration. That's really kind of the bread and butter of what we do when disaster response.
You guys both gave really great examples of how you at the local government are working with other organizations to provide assistance to the community. Um, Turning it outward, what are some ways that either as an economic developer or as a local government representative, you can reach out and connect with diverse groups within the community? Brittany, you kind of touched on this in an earlier question when you referenced that a community of generally older
Oakmont, yeah.
yeah, older residents are all located in one area. But if you want to expand on that or talk about maybe other ways that you guys, as the local government reps, are reaching out and connecting and making sure the full community has access to the resources and knows what's going on.
Sure. So there's a couple lanes to that. The first one I'll touch on is the you mentioned Oakmont. So we look at our community and the makeup of the community, and we identify maybe those areas that have more vulnerable populations in them, like Oakmont that I mentioned, or maybe an area that's predominantly Spanish speaking, or lower income. I mean, you have to look at all aspects that can make somebody more prone to disaster or have greater hardships in recovering from a disaster. And we take a look at those and we do outreach with them throughout the year and go out and do things like preparedness presentations, telling them how they can get prepared within maybe their own senior living community, how they can prepare to support each other during an evacuation, which is very traumatic and chaotic, making sure that they have all the tools or are aware of all the tools and resources out there to get the information they'll need. So we do a ton of outreach like that um, throughout the year. And I'll say it through our community engagement office. We do a lot of outreach with the community through community leaders. We found that's a great avenue to outreach with, you know, all aspects of the community. So whether it's a religious based organization, so maybe a church leader or a community leader that leads the local the local meetup spot, or whatever the case may be, there's natural leaders in the community and you can utilize them as being kind of champions for you and also being ones to relay information to others. So one example is anytime we send out alert and warning messages, we send them out in English and Spanish, and it has to do with how many uh, non-English speaking residents are in your community by percentage. I won't bore you with all of the formulas, but we're only required to do English and Spanish, but we obviously have a ton of other languages spoken in our county and in our city. So we use these community champions to help take our messages and translate them so that folks can understand them. That's really important. Like, we work really closely with a leader in the AAPI community in the city of Santa Rosa, and they have kind of a phone tree process that they use that's just kind of natural for how they share information within their community. So we share the information with this leader, and then she works with her contacts to translate that into a way that they can understand it and know what they need to do and know what's expected of them. So I would say that it's kind of, and meeting people where they're at too. You can't always do a community meeting and say, come to City Hall and tell us what you think about our general plan for the city. Sometimes you have to meet them where they're at too. And that's another way that you can utilize those community leaders of, if we really want your input, what's the best way to reach your community? Maybe it's on a weekend because they all work during the week. And they have kids or whatever the case may be. So it's meeting them where they're at too is really important. And I'm sure Tara's got other things to add, but that's what we do here in the city.
It's great. Tara, do you have any examples you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would love to add to that. And it just goes back to collaboration and coordination and pre-planning. So you want to make sure that you have all those stakeholders and all those diverse groups in that contact list before anything happens. Who's the leader of your local tribe, the church leaders, the, who do you contact for seniors? Is there a senior center?
Yeah, we actually have a saying in emergency management that we use a lot where you don't want to be exchanging business cards when you're knee deep in floodwaters.
Yeah.
You want to know the community and know these people that to outreach with way ahead of the disaster actually happening. So
Yeah.
getting back to coordination and collaboration and everything else we've talked about, spend your time in the quiet times getting to know the business community, the leaders in the community, and knowing and making sure they know what to expect from the government and vice versa, in terms of communication and how to reach us if they need something. So
Those are great examples of how you can work with your community, get out to your community, and make sure that they know the resources and know who you are ahead of time. I really appreciate the quote that you shared, Brittany. It makes a lot of sense. Um, Tara, what do you think are some actions? I mean, you already referenced having that contact list ready ahead of time. So you know who to reach out to during an emergency or a disruption. But what are some other actions that rural communities can take to prepare businesses and the economy for future disruptions and disasters?
Sure. So, Brittany had already mentioned the disaster recovery and resiliency playbook that we were both authors on. And in my chapter 2, I discussed and kind of went into details about setting goals. And your goals can be anything from the economic vitality strategies, the comprehensive economic development strategy, a SEDS, to the contact list, to coordinating and collaborating, like Brittany mentioned, go out and make sure you meet your stakeholders that are going to be involved or affected by emergency, which is pretty much everybody. But maybe narrow it down to economic development. If you're an economic developer, narrow it down to economic development stakeholders. And so that chapter really goes into detail about how to do that and how important goals are. Goals and objectives are pretty much all we do in economic development. We put together, we'll do a project, and we have the goals and objectives of that project, and then we implement those projects with those in mind. And in the case of an emergency, it's really important to have that done beforehand, so that you're prepared. You definitely want to be proactive, and I think unfortunately, a lot of communities in our state have realized that, and rural communities have realized that is you have to be proactive. And I think it probably took Mariposa 3 or 4 emergencies and one really big disaster to realize that. And now I have to say that we are very proactive. All of us, from economic development, planning, building, public works, HHSA, sheriff's office, we're prepared, unfortunately, for that next disaster.
And if I could add just some suggestions, maybe from my perspective. One thing that we do in emergency management a lot is we call them exercises or like mock disaster drills. There's no reason that the business community can't do these as well. And what I'm getting at is, like, for instance, during COVID, we saw how significantly the supply chain was impacted. So before another supply chain disruption, getting some businesses together, maybe with like products to talk about how can our business keep going if we don't have this critical product delivered, or maybe it's delayed by 6 months, or, what would we do as a business to overcome that, and kind of talking through these things before they happen. Because that's what we do in the disaster response side, but it could be really good from a business standpoint to get better prepared for what could happen, right? Let's say we have to shut our doors for 6 months again. Can we continue to pay our staff and our overhead costs? And what is our business going to look like coming out of this, and what is our plan to recover from that? And so maybe something that we utilize in the emergency management world, the exercises could be really beneficial to the business community as well, just to think through and talk about those things before you're having to deal with it real time.
I think that would, if I could chime in, I think that would be really beneficial, Brittany. And we even go a step further, and because of the emergencies that have affected and caused economic disruptions in Mariposa County, we've actually talked about a shift in economic drivers because or a shift in the focus, because we are so dependent on Yosemite National Park. When it closes its door, it is absolutely devastating to the local small business community. So we have talked about resiliency in the forms of creating other attractions or that's part of our economic vitality strategy is diversification. So that when Yosemite, and it's not if, when Yosemite shuts its doors, that we have other options to drive this economy so that we don't lose 100 businesses in a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a key. Diversity is one of the best ways to protect your community from these impacts, just by having a wide variety of businesses and folks working on different things. It's great to hear what you both are doing in your different communities on those topics. Well, we have come to the end of our time together today, but I have one last question for both of you. And this is kind of tough because it's like trying to distill everything you've said into one quick statement. But as economic development professionals, local government professionals, how would you recommend to our listeners that they use the playbook?
So I'll touch on that, Brittany, on the economic development element. I was going to say, before you mentioned the playbook, I thought you were going to say, what did we recommend? And I was going to recommend using that playbook. I recommend looking at it, and not everything is going to ring true in your community. You're going to have to tailor it to your community, because I think I spoke on a broad term in chapter 2, but really tailored it. My experience is in rural communities. So if you're in an urban community, you'll want to tailor it differently. But I would say spend some time and absolutely look at that material. Go through every chapter by chapter. You really want to go slow and really take it in. Take some notes and some data about what you think would impact your specific community. And I think it's so important to realize that book was written and created, the information was from practitioners. It was from people who absolutely have had experience with major disasters, such as the Paradise Fire, the Oak Fire, the fires in Sonoma County. So we speak from an experience standpoint. So I would say absolutely look at it, take notes, and then put your own plans together. So in my section with the setting goals, look at some of the examples that we've put in there and decide what would work for your community. Do you need any EVS? What kind of strategies can you put together that will create resiliency? And then go through all the sections. And I would say share it too. I ordered 10 copies. I gave it to our OES department, and I've I gave a copy to every supervisor so that they're aware of all the resources available. And a lot of that, I would say most of it, is in that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I know Michelle, when you originally asked me to help contribute to the playbook, I was thinking, what is an emergency manager going to offer to a bunch of, economic business development people? And I felt like a little bit of a fish out of water. And I think that's how you can use my chapter in the playbook is role reverse, right? How you as business developers and economists and people driving the community and the economy of your community, how you integrate with emergency responders like myself and the role that you can play and how important it is to response and recovery. So my chapter happened to be chapter 7, where I talk about geographic considerations, and I talked about a lot of them today. Things to look at in your community that could make you more risk averse or more risk prone, and then what to do about it. But I think the most important thing is to know that you absolutely have a role in emergency management and emergency response. Even if you don't think you do, and you felt a little like a fish out of water, like I did with this playbook. Um, Response and recovery can't happen without the business perspective being an integral part of it. Everybody always thinks about fire and police and saving lives, which is so important, but so is the economic stability of the community, and it impacts its ability to recover just as much as the amount of casualties you might face. So use the playbook from that perspective, and hopefully the overview that I gave in chapter 7 of like the different planning processes that take place and maybe where you can fit in will help you speak the emergency management language a little bit better and be able to talk to your local emergency management representatives and say, hey, if I'm not in part of this process already, I want to be, and here's why, and kind of be your own advocate to be a part of the process. That's how I would say to utilize the playbook.
Great. Think you guys did a wonderful job. I mean, I I remember those conversations, Brittany, but I think what we've learned through this whole process is that everyone at the local government level has a role to play. And so everyone should be at the table for these conversations, economic developers, emergency services, community members. Um, yeah, so it's very important to do that outreach and get everyone involved. And obviously, from the work that you've done and the work that you've shared today, Brittany and Tara, you are definitely champions for your community. And I'm sure they are grateful to have you on their teams.
Thank
I'd
you.
like to, yes, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your time today and your expertise. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.